Welcome to University Television Presents. I'm your host, Grace Swanke. Today I'm joined by professor and author Peter Klien. Klein is an American economist who studies managerial and organizational issues. He holds the W. Caruth Endowed Chair and is professor of entrepreneurship at Baylor University's School of Business, where he is also the chair and Department of Entrepreneurship and Corporate Innovation. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's get right into it. So you received your PhD in economics, but now you teach in the entrepreneurship department at Baylor. So how did this transition occur?
Yeah, I've always thought of economics not as a set of topics like inflation or unemployment or labor markets or whatever, but more as a set of principles that allow you to understand a lot of different things. And I was always very interested in things like innovation and economic growth. Where do new businesses and new technologies come from? How do those help to make people better off? And so applying economics to those kinds of phenomena, I think, yields a lot of insight. And entrepreneurship is something that economists, you can study from an economics perspective as well as a psychological perspective or a personal growth perspective.
That's very interesting. So like broadening the horizons and applying it to entrepreneurship. That's really cool. So how is your economics training relevant to your work on entrepreneurship?
Oh, good question. Well, I mean, entrepreneurs, if we think of those as people who start companies or grow companies or run companies, people who introduce new ideas, new technologies, and so forth. I mean, they're also economic actors, economic agents, right? So they have a lot of different motivations, they have psychological motivations, and their sociological phenomena and so forth. But also they think about, they respond to incentives, just like other economic actors. They have to think about how to assemble scarce resources and combine them to create a new business or a new product or serve a new market. And so the kinds of things that economists often deal with and theorize about apply really they apply really well to the kinds of phenomena that people are super interested in today, high tech, and why some countries are wealthier than other countries, and how do we improve people's quality of life through innovation.
Yeah, that's very interesting, the whole psychological aspect of it.
Yeah.
So that's really cool that you were able to marry the two together. So one of your books is titled The Capitalist and the Entrepreneur. That seems to draw a distinction between the two. So how are entrepreneurs different from capitalists or business owners?
Yeah, that's not the most eye-catching title, but what that book is trying to do is think about the function of the entrepreneur or the role of the entrepreneur, which we usually think of as the idea person, the dynamic leader, the inventor, the innovator, from the role of the capitalist, which is the individual or group of individuals or organization that supplies resources, right? Financial resources, but other kind of resources as well. And what I was trying to do in that book is, sort of critique a view that you often see in the entrepreneurship literature, which is that, resources, especially money, those are easy to come by. That's not where the action is. If you have a good idea, if you have a cool product or a new technology or a new market that you can enter, that's really what drives the whole process. Of course, you can get money. I mean, there are rich people out there who will give you money if you've got a good idea. That's no problem. But as I studied these sorts of issues more, I realized that, or I came to believe that often where the real action is the people who have this sort of responsibility for deciding which projects will get pursued and which won't, right? If you flip that around, you could say, well, good ideas are dime a dozen. Everybody's got great ideas, but we only have so much money, we only have a certain amount of assets, labor, and so forth. We can't pursue every good idea that we have, so somebody has to have the job of deciding among these many great ideas that are presented to me, which ones should actually have resources devoted to them. Like, think about an episode of Shark Tank, right? I mean, all of the attention is on the people who are pitching their really cool ideas, but kind of the point of that show is your idea is never going to come to fruition unless you get one of those sharks or some other organization, a bank or crowdfunding or whatever. Somebody's got to put skin in the game. And just having ideas without skin in the game doesn't sort of make things happen. So actually what I was trying to do in that book is bring the entrepreneur role and the capitalist role together and say that you need both of them working in harmony, to get the kinds of outcomes that we all desire.
Right. Yeah, and that's funny because Shark Tank was the first thing I thought of too when you said that. So what would you say the function of entrepreneurs is in the market economy?
Now that itself is a really good question, because if you look at authors and thinkers who have dealt with that issue, they're not all on the same page about what that function is, right? So some of them conceive it as sort of a faculty of awareness, awareness or alertness to new opportunities in the environment. Like, I'm the first one to realize that if you think about, Apple under Steve Jobs when the iPhone was under development, mobile phones were a completely different kind of a thing. There were Blackberries or there were flip phones or whatever. And Steve Jobs recognized that, boy, if we create a device that is admittedly a lot more expensive and less durable, more fragile than the devices that people are currently using, but can do so many more things, people will be willing to pay for that, and will open up a whole new sort of market niche with apps and all these things that you can do. Somebody else would have figured that out eventually, but Steve Jobs happened to be the first. He was more aware of that opportunity than others. He was the first to grab it. And so that's one way of thinking about what entrepreneurs do. But another way of thinking about the entrepreneurial function is that we live in a world of a lot of uncertainty, right? You don't know for sure that the thing that you produce, even as a student, right? Should I major in this topic or that topic? Well, I have some idea. If I choose this major, I can get this kind of job, I can have this kind of career in life. If I choose this major, it'll be completely different. But none of that is guaranteed, right? So sometimes you have to sort of take a leap of faith, or rather you have to rely on your own kind of gut instinct to take one course of action over another. So another way of thinking about what entrepreneurs do is they're the kinds of people who are sufficiently comfortable with and confident in their own kind of idiosyncratic judgment that they're willing to zig when everybody else is going to zag. And so without people willing to do that, we are not able to, experience all of these benefits from novelty and high, improvements in performance and so forth. So to make a long story short, there are different ways of conceiving of that entrepreneurial function, and how we look at the entrepreneur in that way might affect, how we think of how to make things better for entrepreneurs, how to make it easier for entrepreneurs to make our lives better.
Yeah. So along the lines of entrepreneurs and things, what laws and institutions are necessary for entrepreneurs to perform?
Now that's a great question. I think, many people approach that issue from the perspective of, what can the legal system, what can politicians and other institutions do? How do we help the entrepreneur? How do we hold the entrepreneur's hand? Give them encouragement, give them money maybe, give them sort of subsidies, or give them some protection from competition to allow their ideas to take hold. The problem is that's more of what you might call a top-down approach to entrepreneurship. It's like we're going to sort of socially engineer how do we put the right people in place, and how do we make sure they have the resources that they need to be able to create these specific things that we want. There's another way of thinking about the role of laws and institutions and policies, which is more bottom up. And that speaks to the idea that we really have no idea, what will be the next big thing in tech or in agriculture or in transportation or whatever. Who knows? You and I don't know today, but what we want is an environment where a lot of entrepreneurs can give it a go, right? We want an environment where people are free to experiment. They can try different things. They may not be successful, and if they're successful, well, they're going to have to move on and try something else. But rather than try to sort of channel or direct the flow of entrepreneurship toward particular goals, we just say we want a competitive market environment where entrepreneurs have as few obstacles as possible to trying out new stuff, and then we sort of let the chips fall where they may. So I'm a proponent of high levels of economic freedom, strong property, protection of private property, allowing people to experiment with different things, and then not trying to sort of, decide ahead of time what outcome we want and nudge us in that direction.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I like that analogy of the bottom up instead of top down. I think that that's very unique. Okay, so a little bit of a different route. So your most recent book is entitled Why Managers Matter, The Perils of the Bossless Company. What is a bossless company?
Yeah. So one of my colleagues and I had been thinking about this for a while and teaching in our classes about, I teach a course in business strategy for undergraduate business students and also for MBA students. And one of the things we talk about is organizational design. How do you set up a company or any organization to be more successful? Do you have it very centralized, where you have strong leadership at the top, giving a lot of direction to people at the bottom in a traditional kind of hierarchical model? Or do you have a looser, flatter, less structured kind of a system where you get rid of the layers of middle management and you flatten the hierarchy? So the idea of a flat company, a bossless company is an extremely flat organization such that there is almost, maybe not literally, but almost nobody at the top, but people at the bottom are sort of free to do whatever they want. There are a lot of famous examples. One that that students might be familiar with is the video game company Valve, that's more of a platform now that distributes a lot of popular video games. I think Counter-Strike is one of their most popular titles. Valve is famously organized as an almost bossless company where there's no middle management, there's very little senior management. Programmers, coders, designers, and other people involved in producing video games have a lot of latitude to sort of do whatever they want. And my colleague and I thought, gosh, there's this idea that the bossless company or the super flat hierarchy is the wave of the future. And the traditional company with its managerial pyramid or whatever is old-fashioned and obsolete, and we should get rid of it. And so because I like to kind of challenge the conventional thinking, we thought, let's write a book criticizing the idea of the flat hierarchy and defending the traditional managerial function. And so that's what our book is really about.
Very interesting. So are companies without bosses a good or bad idea to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, the easy answer, this is the typical professor answer, right, is, well, it kind of depends on the circumstances.
Right.
But I'm really not totally being silly when I say that, in that part of the narrative, what we call the narrative of the bossless company, is the claim that because a few companies, like Valve, for example, seem to be doing pretty well without a lot of formal structure, therefore all companies, all organizations should get rid of the bosses and get rid of the middle managers and make things as flat as possible. And we said, wait a minute, hold on. What if, there's no one-size-fits-all solution? What if the organizational design that works best for one company or one university or whatever is, what if it's different from one to the next? What if it depends on the circumstances, depends on the technology or the market or the kind of people that you have? So what we're criticizing is not bossless companies per se, but the idea that it's always better for firms to get flatter and leaner and more agile and get rid of the sort of traditional structures. We don't think that's true in every case.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there is a time when a bossless company works best? Like, what would that scenario be, I guess?
Yeah, so think of it this way. In a complicated, complex sort of production structure, we have different pieces doing different things. Like, think about Adam Smith famously described the division of labor in a pin factory. He said, well, instead of one workman, like a little hat pin, instead of one worker making the entire pin, if you have one person who straightens the wire, and one person who cuts the wire, and one person who puts the little head on the pin, like an assembly line, you can produce more pins than each person doing every step of the pin. And maybe the best known example of that is Henry Ford and his idea of the assembly line. The problem with the assembly line is, yeah, sure, I mean, let's say there are 3 steps. One step is somebody builds the chassis for the car, the frame for the car. Next person assembles the engine, and then a third person puts the engine into the chassis. And each of those is, say, a separate step in the assembly line. Yeah, of course, it's more efficient to make cars that way than to have one person, a hobbyist building a car in their garage on the weekends. But, you have to have all those different pieces sort of matching up, right? When the engine is ready to be inserted into the chassis, it has to be the right size. The parts have to fit. Right? If you've ever bought furniture from IKEA and tried to build it yourself, if the holes aren't lined up, you know how frustrating that can be? You need everything to line up, and you need everything to be at a certain speed. If the chassis are coming faster than the engines can be built, you get a backlog, or if there's a shortage, people get frustrated. So that is a production process where there's a lot of coordination needed among the different stages. And that's a case where you may need some managers to make sure that everything fits, everything is at the right speed. You can't just tell the chassis guy, hey, you do it your way, An engine guy, hey, you do whatever you want, because then the pieces don't fit together. On the other hand, there are other production processes where you really don't have much interdependence among the different parts, right? Like, taking classes in your major. You can allow each professor a lot of latitude to choose what they do in their classes, because you don't need each class to tightly fit the next class. I mean, you need some, but you don't need that much central coordination. So in that model, a flatter structure tends to work better. So we say there are things like the amount of interdependency among the different stages that determine whether a more vertical structure or a flatter structure works best.
So it's really not just a one-size-fits-all. That's
Yeah,
really
exactly.
cool.
There's, different models work better in different circumstances. We shouldn't be trying to push one solution for everything.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. That's all the time we have for today, but we really enjoyed hearing about your upcoming book. I'm Grace Swanke, and we'll see you next time on University Television Presents.